The Crimean War was a complex conflict, a clash of empires on the shores of the Black Sea. By autumn of 1854, the Allied armies of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire had laid siege to the vital Russian port of Sevastopol. The British forces established their primary supply base at the small port of Balaclava, south of the main siege lines. A single, vulnerable road connected Balaclava to the heights where the siege was underway. To protect this crucial supply line, a series of defensive positions known as redoubts were established along a ridge called the Causeway Heights. These redoubts were manned primarily by Turkish troops, allied with the British and French. On the morning of October 25th, 1854, the Russian army, under the command of General Pavel Liprandi, launched a major assault. Their objective was to sever the British supply line and potentially force the lifting of the siege. Russian attack began with a heavy artillery bombardment on the Ottoman-held redoubts. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Turkish soldiers fought bravely, but were eventually forced to retreat. The Russians successfully captured the redoubts and, with them, several British naval guns that had been positioned there. This initial success created a serious threat to the British base at Balaclava. As Russian cavalry advanced to exploit the breakthrough, they were met by an astonishingly thin formation of British infantry. The 93rd Highland Regiment, commanded by Sir Colin Campbell, stood their ground against a massive cavalry charge. This action would become famously known as the Thin Red Line. Their disciplined volleys of rifle fire broke the Russian charge, forcing the cavalry to veer away in disarray. Shortly thereafter, the British Heavy Brigade, under Major General James Scarlett, also achieved a remarkable victory. They executed a spontaneous, uphill charge against a much larger Russian cavalry force that had paused in the valley. The sheer momentum and ferocity of the Heavy Brigade's attack shattered the Russian formation, sending them into a full retreat. From his high vantage point, the overall British commander, Lord Raglan, witnessed these events unfold. He could see that the Russians were preparing to remove the captured British guns from the Causeway Heights redoubts. Losing artillery pieces was considered a great dishonor, and Raglan was determined to prevent it. He decided to dispatch the cavalry to intervene immediately. He dictated a hurried order to his quartermaster general, Richard Airy. The order read, "Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns." This seemingly clear instruction was to become the source of a catastrophic misunderstanding. The order was given to Captain Louis Nolan, a brilliant but impetuous aide-de-camp, to deliver. Nolan was known to hold a low opinion of the cavalry commander, the Earl of Lucan. He galloped down from the heights to deliver the message to Lord Lucan, who commanded the entire cavalry division. Lord Lucan, from his position on the valley floor, could not see the specific guns on the Causeway Heights that Raglan was referring to. The only Russian guns visible to him were a formidable battery positioned at the very end of the North Valley, a mile and a quarter away. Confused, Lucan asked Captain Nolan, "What guns, sir?" In a moment of fatal impatience, Nolan is said to have flung his arm out and declared, "There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns." His gesture did not point towards the Causeway Heights, but directly down the length of the valley towards the main Russian battery. This valley was flanked on both sides by Russian riflemen and artillery on the heights. To charge down, it was to advance into a prepared killing ground. Despite his severe misgivings, Lucan felt he had no choice but to obey the direct order. He rode over to the commander of the Light Brigade, his brother-in-law, the Earl of Cardigan. The relationship between Lucan and Cardigan was notoriously toxic. They despised each other. Cardigan, upon hearing the order, was aghast. He pointed out the battery at the end of the valley and the guns on either flank. Lucan replied coldly that he had no choice but to obey Lord Raglan's command. Cardigan saluted, turned to his men, and prepared to lead the charge. The Light Brigade consisted of approximately 670 cavalrymen. They were composed of lancers, hussars, and light dragoons, lightly armed and armored. Their primary roles were reconnaissance and skirmishing, not frontal assaults on prepared artillery. The bugle sounded the advance. Lord Cardigan placed himself at the front, alone, and led his brigade forward at a trot. The trot became a canter, and then a full gallop. Almost immediately, the Russian guns on the Fedukin heights to their left opened fire. Then the guns on the causeway heights to their right joined the barrage. The brigade was funneled into a corridor of deadly crossfire. Captain Nolan, who was riding with the charge, was one of the first to be killed. Men and horses began to fall in horrifying numbers. Survivors described the air being filled with the whistle of shells and the roar of cannon. The ground was littered with the dead and dying. Yet the Light Brigade did not break. They maintained their formation as best they could, closing ranks as men fell. Lord Cardigan, miraculously untouched, continued to lead from the front. He was the first to reach the Russian battery at the end of the valley. The surviving lancers and hussars crashed into the Russian gun crews. A desperate, chaotic melee ensued around the guns. The British cavalrymen, enraged and desperate, fought with incredible ferocity. They managed to silence the battery, but their victory was fleeting. They had no infantry support to hold the position. Lord Lucan had halted the heavy brigade, believing the charge to be a lost cause and wanting to preserve his remaining men. Russian cavalry began to close in on the survivors from the flanks. The order was given to retreat. Ride back up the valley was just as perilous as the charge down. The Russian gunners, having recovered, once again opened fire. Men who had survived the charge were killed on the retreat. Slowly, in small, scattered groups, the survivors made their way back to the British lines. The entire action had lasted no more than 20 minutes. Of the roughly 670 men who charged, around 110 were killed and 160 were wounded. The Light Brigade had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Lord Raglan was furious, blaming Lucan for misinterpreting the order. Lucan, in turn, blamed the deceased Captain Nolan for his fatal gesture and Raglan for the ambiguous wording. Lord Cardigan, who had ridden back separately after the initial chaos at the guns, was initially hailed as a national hero in Britain. However, he was later accused of abandoning his men in the melee. News of the disastrous charge shocked the British public. The story was immortalized by the poet laureate, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Goddard. His poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, was published shortly after the event. The poem captured the public's imagination, turning a military blunder into a legendary tale of heroism. It celebrated the unwavering courage of the soldiers while acknowledging the folly of the command. The phrase, "the Valley of Death," became forever associated with the charge. The Battle of Balaclava itself ended in a strategic stalemate. The Russians failed to break the siege, but they held the heights, making the coming winter a misery for the Allies. Charge remains a potent symbol of the clash between leadership and loyalty. It is a timeless and tragic story of incredible bravery in the face of almost certain death. The valley fell silent as the last of the survivors cleared the field of fire. On the ridge, Lord Raglan lowered his telescope, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The French General Bosquet, watching from the heights, uttered the famous words, C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre. It is magnificent, but it is not war. It is. His words perfectly encapsulated the glorious, pointless tragedy. The roll call for the Light Brigade that evening was a grim affair. Name after name was met with silence. Horses that returned without their riders were a particularly sad sight. Many of the animals were themselves grievously wounded. The 17th Lancers, known as the Death or Glory Boys, had suffered immensely. Their white-plumed lances, so striking at the start, were now broken and stained. The 13th Light Dragoons and the 11th Hussars shared a similar fate. The cherry-red trousers of the 11th Hussars were a conspicuous target. The brigade's commander, Lord Cardigan, had ridden to his personal yacht, anchored in Balaclava harbor, for dinner. This act would later fuel accusations that he was detached from the fate of his soldiers. Suffering of the wounded was immense, and medical care was primitive. The story of the charge, reported by journalist William Howard Russell for the Times, electrified London. Russell's dispatches were the first real war correspondence, bringing the reality of the conflict home. His writing did not shy away from the incompetence of the High Command. The public outcry led to reforms in the British Army. The system of purchasing commissions, which allowed wealthy but incompetent men to become officers, came under intense scrutiny. The bravery of the common soldier had been betrayed by the aristocracy of its leadership. The valley itself, once a nameless stretch of land, was now etched into history. Veterans of the charge would recount the story for the rest of their lives. Some survivors even had their voices recorded on phonograph cylinders decades later. The charge became a cautionary tale taught in military academies worldwide. It highlighted the absolute necessity of clear, unambiguous orders. The captured guns that prompted the order were eventually secured by the Russians and removed. The sacrifice of the Light Brigade had, in the end, achieved nothing tangible. But its legacy was one of immortal, if tragic, glory. The courage of the 600 became a benchmark for military valor. The echoes of their hoofbeats faded, but the story never would. The soldiers had followed their orders to the letter, despite the obvious peril. Discipline in the face of annihilation was almost superhuman. The Russian artillerymen were reportedly stunned that the charge did not falter. They had expected the brigade to break and flee at any moment. The psychological impact on the Russian gunners was significant. For a few chaotic moments, a handful of horsemen controlled the might of the Russian battery. The retreat was a scattered, desperate affair, every man for himself. Some men were taken prisoner by Russian cavalry who swept in. The sight of the returning survivors was a profound shock to the onlookers. Uniforms that were pristine an hour before were now shredded and blood-soaked. Controversy between Raglan and Lucan would rage on for years. Lucan demanded a court-martial to clear his name, but it was denied. The official report was carefully worded to protect the reputation of the High Command. But the soldiers knew the truth. They had been sent to their deaths by a foolish blunder. Their heroism was a direct consequence of their leaders' incompetence. The legend of the charge would grow with each telling. It became a story of national pride, a symbol of British stoicism. The tragic reality was often glossed over in favor of the romance. Yet, the charge of the Light Brigade remains a stark reminder of the true cost of war.